Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight we drift into the shadows of the disappearance of Sneha Philip. Imagine, if you will, the city of New York on the afternoon of Monday, September 10th, 2001. It is a day of heavy, lingering humidity, the kind of late summer heat that clings to the limestone buildings and settles into the cracks of the sidewalk. The air is thick with the scent of roasted coffee, exhaust, and the salt spray from the Hudson River. In a sunny, one-bedroom apartment at 225 Rector Place, nestled in the quiet corner of Battery Park City, 31-year-old Dr. Sneha Philip is enjoying a rare day of rest. The apartment is filled with the soft, rhythmic sounds of two kittens, Figa and Kali, as they dart across the hardwood floors. Earlier that morning, Sneha had stood in her bathroom, carefully repotting 4 purple and white orchids that had arrived as a gift from Hawaii. She placed them gently in the bathtub to drain, their delicate petals shimmering under the bathroom light. For 2 hours, she sat before her computer, the blue light reflecting in her eyes as she exchanged instant messages with her mother. They spoke of mundane things, of weddings in the spring, and of the music her husband, Ron, had played on his guitar over the weekend. Around 4 o'clock, she signed off, leaving the domestic stillness of her home behind. She stepped out into the bustling energy of Lower Manhattan, a silhouette in a brown, short-sleeved dress and simple sandals, her dark hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. She carried with her a sense of purpose, a list of errands to run before the day dissolved into evening. As the sun began its slow descent behind the skyline, casting long, amber shadows across the canyons of the financial district, Sneha made her way to Century 21. This department store, a labyrinth of discounted luxury and bustling shoppers, stood as a landmark of the neighborhood, just a few short blocks from the soaring towers of the World Trade Center. Inside, the atmosphere was a sharp contrast to the humid streets. The air was cooled by industrial fans, carrying the mingled scents of leather, starched cotton, and 100 different perfumes. The floors were polished to a mirror-like shine, reflecting the flickering glow of long fluorescent tubes overhead. There is a specific kind of hum in a store like this. The rustle of silk hangers sliding across metal racks, the soft thud of shoe boxes being stacked, and the distant, rhythmic beep of cash registers. Sneha moved through the aisles with the ease of a regular. Somewhere above, tucked into the corners of the ceiling, a security camera turned its unblinking eye toward the coat department. It is here that the record of Sneha Philip's life transitions from the vibrant reality of the living to the ghost-like grain of surveillance footage. The image is black and white, flickering with the static of an analog tape. We see her, a figure caught in time, browsing through the racks of heavy winter coats, her hand reaching out to feel the texture of a sleeve. She appears calm, perhaps even a bit tired from the day's heat, but entirely ordinary. She is a woman shopping on a Monday evening, unaware that these few seconds of film will one day be scrutinized by investigators, lawyers, and a grieving family for decades to come. The details of her purchases tell the story of a woman looking toward the future, toward a home she intended to return to. Using her husband's American Express card, she selected a set of fine bed linens, 3 pieces of high-thread count cotton, crisp and cool to the touch. She chose a new dress, the fabric light and dark, and a delicate set of lingerie. These were not the choices of someone planning to vanish into the night. They were the choices of someone caring for her sanctuary, preparing for a quiet night in or perhaps a romantic evening ahead. After finishing in the main store, she walked to the shoe annex next door. The transition between the buildings was brief, a moment of feeling the heavy Manhattan air before entering the world of leather and soles. There, she selected 3 pairs of shoes. Imagine the weight of those bags as she stood at the counter, the crinkle of the heavy plastic, the way the handles dug slightly into her palms. The total came to $550.69. It was just after 6 o'clock in the evening when the transaction was finalized. The sales clerk would later remember a woman matching Sneha's description, perhaps accompanied by another woman with dark skin, though the security tapes would only show Sneha standing alone. This discrepancy remains one of the many small, haunting mysteries of that night. Was there a friend, a confidant, waiting just out of frame? Or was the clerk's memory simply clouded by the thousands of faces that passed her register every day? In the footage, Sneha is solitary, a quiet presence in a world of moving shadows. When Sneha stepped out of the shoe annex and back onto the sidewalk, the sky had begun to change. The oppressive humidity of the afternoon was finally breaking, but not with a gentle breeze. Huge, dark clouds were rolling in from the west, swallowing the orange glow of the sunset. The first few drops of rain began to fall, heavy, warm droplets that left dark circles on the dry pavement. Within minutes, the sky opened up. A massive late-summer thunderstorm swept over Manhattan, turning the city into a world of blurred lights and rushing water. Thunder rumbled between the skyscrapers, a deep, vibrating sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the street. Lightning illuminated the twin towers in jagged, silver flashes, their silhouettes standing like giants against the storm. People scrambled for cover under awnings and inside subway entrances, but Sneha was already moving away from the camera's reach. She carried her shopping bags, shielding them as best she could from the downpour. The streets were slick, reflecting the neon signs of the nearby diners and the yellow headlights of the crawling taxis. This is the last time we can be certain where she was. She walked into the gathering darkness and the torrential rain, a woman with a bag of new linens and shoes, heading toward an evening that remains an absolute blank. Behind her, the department store lights flickered in the puddles. The city was loud with the sound of the storm, a chaotic symphony of wind and rain that washed away her footprints as quickly as she made them. As the night wore on, the storm eventually passed, leaving New York in a rare, rain-washed silence. The air grew cool and remarkably clear. In the apartment at Rector Place, Ron Lieberman arrived home from his shift at the hospital near midnight. He found the apartment quiet, the kittens waiting by the door. He noticed that the bed was empty, but he did not feel the cold prickle of fear, not yet. Sneha was known to stay out late with friends, to lose track of time in the vibrant, never-ending pulse of the city. He checked the messages on their machine, finding nothing from her. He assumed she was at her cousin's apartment or perhaps had decided to stay with a friend to avoid traveling in the remnants of the storm. He petted the cats, checked on the orchids still sitting in the bathtub, and eventually surrendered to sleep. He could not have known that the shopping bags she had filled at Century 21 would never be found. He could not have known that the dress she wore in the grainy footage would never hang in their closet again. Outside their window, the city rested beneath a sky that was slowly turning a deep, expectant blue. The morning of September 11th was only hours away, and the world was about to change in ways that would make the disappearance of one woman both a singular tragedy and a mystery, swallowed by a much larger shadow. For now, we leave Sneha there, in the memory of the department store mirror, a flicker of a life captured in the quiet moments before the storm. The clock on the wall of their apartment at 225 Rector Place ticked with a heavy, rhythmic thud, marking the final minutes before midnight on September 10th, 2001. Ron Lieberman pushed the heavy door open, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoing through the hushed entryway. He expected to hear the familiar sounds of home, perhaps the soft hum of a television or the light patter of Sneha's footsteps on the hardwood. Instead, he was met by a silence so thick it felt tangible. The air inside was still, holding the faint, lingering scent of the orchids Sneha had repotted earlier that day, a mix of damp earth and delicate floral notes. He hung his coat on the brass hook and walked toward the bedroom, his shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. The apartment was tidy, almost unnervingly so. In the bedroom, the linens were pulled taut across the bed, undisturbed and cool to the touch. He noticed that her glasses were resting on the nightstand, their thin frames catching a glint of light from the street lamp outside. She was not there. Ron felt a flicker of annoyance, the kind that stems from a long day and a missed connection. He assumed she was staying late with her brother or perhaps a friend, caught up in the rhythm of the city. He lay down on his side of the bed, the expanse of the empty mattress beside him feeling strangely wide, and eventually drifted into a restless sleep, unaware that the world he knew was in its final hours of normalcy. Morning arrived with a clarity that New Yorkers would later describe as severe. When Ron's alarm sounded at 6:30 on the morning of September 11th, the sun was already beginning to spill into the room, painting long, golden rectangles across the carpet. He reached across the bed, his hand meeting only the smooth, cold fabric of the sheets. Sneha had still not returned. A low-level hum of concern began to vibrate in his chest, but he suppressed it, focusing on the mechanical requirements of his morning routine. He showered in the pale light, the water hissing against the tile, and dressed for his shift at Jacobi Medical Center. He left the apartment by 6:45, the lobby of the building quiet as he stepped out into the crisp, autumn air. Above him, the sky was a deep, unblemished cerulean, the kind of blue that looked fragile, like fine porcelain. He descended into the subway, the steel train screeching as it pulled away from the station, carrying him north toward the Bronx. Behind him, the twin towers of the World Trade Center stood like silent sentinels, their silver facades reflecting the rising sun. It was a perfect morning, tranquil and bright, with nothing to suggest that in less than 2 hours, the very ground beneath his home would begin to tremble. By 8:46, Ron was deep within the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of Jacobi Medical Center. The hospital was a world of white coats and the staccato rhythm of monitors, a place where time was measured in heartbeats and dosages. He was focused on his patients, moving through the emergency department with the practiced efficiency of a resident. He did not hear the sound of the first impact, the thunderous roar of American Airlines Flight 11 as it tore into the North Tower just 3 blocks from his front door. But the news traveled like a physical wave, rippling through the hospital staff in whispers that quickly escalated into shouts. Someone turned on a television in a waiting area, and a crowd began to gather, their faces pale under the harsh lights. Ron stood at the back of the group, his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched the smoke billowing from the side of the tower. He knew that view. He knew the exact angle of the building because it was the scenery he and Sneha looked at every morning from their windows. At first, there was the desperate hope of an accident, a tragic pilot error. But then, at 9:03, the second plane appeared on the screen, a dark silhouette slicing through the blue sky before erupting into a ball of orange fire against the South Tower. The collective gasp in the room was followed by a chilling, absolute silence. The realization set in like a cold weight in his stomach. This was not an accident, and Sneha was still missing. The hospital shifted into a state of high-alert chaos, a frantic preparation for a wave of casualties that everyone expected but few could comprehend. Ron moved through the motions of his duties, but his mind was a storm of static and fear. He found a telephone and began to dial their home number, his fingers trembling as he pressed the buttons. The line rang and rang, a hollow, mechanical sound that offered no comfort. He tried her cell phone, but the calls wouldn't go through. The network already choked by the thousands of people trying to reach loved ones in the lower part of the city. Between tasks, he would return to the television, watching as the towers began to burn with a terrifying intensity. He thought of their apartment, located so close to the base of the buildings that the heat must be felt through the glass. He wondered if Sneha had finally returned home just as the disaster began. He pictured her in the lobby, or perhaps in the kitchen, looking out at the sky as it turned black with soot. The uncertainty was a physical pain, a sharp ache in his chest that grew with every passing minute. When the towers eventually collapsed, turning into mountains of white dust and twisted steel, the world outside the hospital windows seemed to dim. The national tragedy was now inextricably woven into the fabric of his own life, a gargantuan event that had swallowed the simple, private mystery of his wife's absence. As the afternoon wore on, the expected influx of patients at Jacobi did not materialize. The realization was sobering. Those who had been in the towers were either safe or they were gone. There was very little middle ground for the emergency rooms to fill. Driven by a desperate need to find her, Ron used his medical credentials to navigate the military and police blockades that had been thrown up around the city. He managed to hitch a ride in an ambulance heading downtown, the vehicle weaving through empty streets that felt like a movie set after the actors had fled. As they neared Lower Manhattan, the air changed. It became thick and gritty, smelling of pulverized concrete, burnt plastic, and something metallic that tasted like copper on the tongue. Everything was coated in a fine, ghostly gray ash. He eventually had to continue on foot, his shoes sinking into the several inches of dust that covered the pavement like a fresh, macabre snowfall. He walked toward Battery Park City, shielding his eyes against the swirling debris. The silence here was different than the silence of the morning. It was the heavy, muffled quiet of a graveyard. He reached the perimeter of their building, the structure still standing but looking weathered and abandoned. The search for Sneha had begun in earnest. But as he looked toward the smoldering remains of the World Trade Center, the scale of the destruction made the search feel like looking for a single grain of sand in a desert of glass. The morning of September 12th, 2001, did not arrive with the usual sounds of a waking city. There was no rhythmic clatter of the garbage trucks, no distant hum of the morning commute, and no birdsong in the trees of Battery Park. Instead, there was a heavy, suffocating silence, punctuated only by the occasional low rumble of heavy machinery or the sharp, lonely wail of a distant siren. The air itself had changed. It was thick and gritty, tasting of pulverized concrete and something metallic that hung at the back of the throat. A fine, gray powder, a ghost like snow, had settled over everything. It covered the parked cars, the abandoned bicycles, and the black iron fences, smoothing out the sharp edges of the world until Manhattan looked like a charcoal drawing that had been smudged by a giant hand. Ron stood in the center of this altered landscape, his lungs burning with every shallow breath. The dread that had been a dull ache the night before was now a sharp, jagged blade in his chest. Sneha was not home. She had not called. And as he looked toward the place where the towers should have been, seeing only a massive, roiling plume of black and ochre smoke against the pale blue sky, the terrifying truth began to crystallize. The woman he loved, the woman who had shared his coffee and his dreams only 48 hours prior, was missing in the middle of a war zone. In the frantic hours that followed, a narrative began to take shape among Sneha's family and friends, a story born of both deep knowing and a desperate need for sense. To those who knew her best, the idea that Sneha might have simply vanished into the chaos was impossible to reconcile with her character. They spoke of her as a healer, someone whose hands were trained to mend and whose heart was wired to respond. Her mother, Ansu, and her husband, Ron, shared a singular guiding conviction. Sneha was a physician. It was not just her job. It was her identity. They envisioned her at the moment the first plane struck the North Tower at 8:46 in the morning. They saw her, perhaps standing on a street corner or stepping out of a shop, looking up and seeing the devastation. In their minds, she didn't run away from the heat and the glass. She didn't seek shelter in the subway or cower in a doorway. Instead, they believed she had felt the ancient, heavy pull of the Hippocratic Oath. They imagined her straightening her shoulders, pulling her hair back, and moving toward the towers with the steady, purposeful stride of a woman who knew exactly what she was meant to do in a crisis. To them, she wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was a soldier of medicine, who had walked into the fire to help the wounded. Armed with this belief, Ron began a physical search that was as exhaustive as it was agonizing. Because he was a doctor himself, an emergency room resident at Jacobi Medical Center, he possessed the unique ability to bypass the growing perimeters of the frozen zone. He wore his medical credentials around his neck like a talisman, the laminated plastic catching the dim, dusty light. He walked through streets that felt like a nightmare, passing through checkpoints where police officers and National Guardsmen stood with hollow eyes and masks pulled tight over their faces. He searched for her in the most literal sense, his boots crunching through inches of gray ash that felt like walking on a layer of fine, dry sand. The silence of the streets was unnatural, a heavy blanket that swallowed the sound of his own footsteps. He reached their apartment on Rector Place, only a few blocks from the site of the collapse. Inside, the windows had been left open to catch the late summer breeze 2 days before. Now, the interior was transformed. A thick layer of soot covered the dining table, the kitchen counters, and the sofa. He looked down at the floor, his heart stopping. He saw the tiny, delicate paw prints of their 2 kittens, Figa and Collie, weaving through the dust. But there were no other marks. No human footprints. No sign that Sneha had returned to the apartment since the world had ended. The space felt hollow, a shell of a life that had been interrupted mid-sentence. The search moved from the empty apartment to the crowded, chaotic halls of Manhattan's hospitals. Ron and Sneha's brother, John, began a grim pilgrimage to every medical facility in the city. They started at St. Vincent's Hospital in the West Village, which had become the primary triage center for the survivors. The scene there was one of frantic, organized desperation. Outside, the brick walls were beginning to disappear behind a carpet of white paper. Thousands of missing posters were being taped up, one over the other, until they looked like scales on a great paper beast. Ron added Sneha's face to the wall. The flyer featured a photo of her with a bright, warm smile, a contrast to the gray reality surrounding it. Beneath the photo, the details were stark. Sneha Ann Philip, 31 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, last seen wearing a brown short-sleeved dress. Ron's fingers were sticky with tape and stained with ink as he moved from one hospital to the next. Bellevue, New York University Medical Center, Beit Israel. At each stop, he would approach the busy nurses at the intake desks, showing his badge and the flyer, asking the same question until his voice became a raspy whisper. "Have you seen her? She's a doctor. She might have been helping." He searched the handwritten lists of Jane Does, women who had arrived unconscious or unable to identify themselves, hoping to find her name, yet terrified of what it would mean if he did. As the sun began to set on the 13th of September, the city was bathed in a strange, bruised purple light. The smoke from Ground Zero continued to drift uptown, carrying the scent of a world being consumed. For Ron and the Philip family, the physician's duty narrative became a lifeline. It was the only story that allowed them to breathe. If she was at the towers, she was there with a purpose. She was there as a hero. They clung to the possibility that she was simply too busy tending to patients in a basement clinic or an improvised field hospital to call home. They imagined her in a white coat, her brow dampened with sweat, her hands steady as she bandaged a stranger. This image was more tolerable than the alternative, the silence of an empty apartment and the lack of footprints in the ash. They distributed over 5,000 flyers across the city, handing them to strangers, taping them to lamp posts, and placing them in the hands of exhausted rescue workers. Every time the phone rang, the air in the room would vanish as they waited to hear her voice. But as the days turned into a week, the flyers began to curl at the edges, the ink smudging under the light rain that finally began to fall. The gray dust turned to mud, and the city began to realize that the expected wave of survivors was not coming. The hospitals remained eerily quiet, the emergency rooms standing ready for patients who would never arrive. In the heart of the silence, The search for the doctor who had gone to help became a search for a ghost. The smoke of the 13th of September still hung heavy in the lungs of the city, a thick, gray veil that refused to lift. But as the investigation into the whereabouts of Dr. Sneha Philip deepened, the eyes of the searchers turned away from the burning horizon and back toward a series of digital ghosts. Within the quiet, sterile confines of a security office, the air smelled of ozone and cold coffee. The world outside was reeling, but inside this room, time was being rewound, second by agonizing second. The focus shifted to a small, flickering monitor that held the secrets of 225 Rector Place, the apartment building where Sneha and Ron had shared their lives. The screen was a window into a world that no longer existed, a world where the sky was still a perfect, unblemished blue, and the morning air was crisp with the promise of a late summer Tuesday. The tape hissed with a low, rhythmic static, a sound like a distant sea, as the tracking lines struggled to find their place. We are looking at the morning of September 11th, 19 minutes before the world would pivot on its axis. The footage is grainy, a sequence of black and white stills captured by a camera that blinked every few seconds, leaving gaps of darkness between each frame of life. The lobby of the building is bathed in a harsh, high-contrast light. The sun, positioned low in the eastern sky, pours through the glass doors, washing out the details of the floor and turning the far wall into a brilliant, blinding white canvas. At exactly 8:43 in the morning, a figure enters the frame. The time stamp at the bottom of the screen flickers in blocky, digital letters, marking the final moments of a vanishing era. The figure is a woman. She moves with a familiar grace, a certain weight in her step that suggests a long night finally coming to an end. She is seen only in silhouette, a dark shape against the golden glare of the morning sun. Her hair is pulled back, perhaps in a ponytail or a loose bun, and she wears a dress that mirrors the one Sneha had been wearing in the department store footage from the evening before. There is a haunting quality to the way the camera captures her. Because of the slow frame rate, she seems to glide across the lobby rather than walk, appearing in one spot and then another, a ghost navigating the architecture of the living. She approaches the elevator bank, her hand reaching out toward the call button. In the silence of the recording, you can almost hear the soft click of the plastic under her finger. She stands there for a moment, her back to the camera, waiting. The lobby is quiet. There are no other residents visible, no doorman in the immediate line of sight. Just this lone woman, standing in the cathedral of light, waiting for a carriage that will take her up to the quiet sanctuary of her home. As the seconds tick toward 8:44, the woman in the video does something curious. She doesn't wait for the elevator to arrive. Instead, she turns her head, looking toward the ceiling or perhaps toward the doors she just entered. There is a subtle shift in her posture, a sudden alertness. Her mannerisms are what draw the eye. Ron, watching this footage later with a heart heavy as lead, would see his wife in the tilt of that head, in the specific way she held her shoulders when she was tired but determined. It was a language of the body that only a husband could truly translate. But the image is frustratingly thin. The sunlight has stripped away her features, leaving only the suggestion of a face, a map of shadows where her eyes and mouth should be. One detail, however, stands out with a chilling clarity. She is not carrying any bags. The large brown shopping bags from Century 21, the ones filled with linens and 3 pairs of new shoes, are nowhere to be seen. If this is Sneha, she has been somewhere else first. She has left her purchases behind, or perhaps she never had them at all on this final morning. The absence of those bags creates a void in the narrative, a missing piece of the puzzle that suggests a hidden chapter between her shopping trip and this bright, final entrance. Suddenly, the woman turns away from the elevators. She does not wait for the doors to slide open. She moves back toward the exit, her pace slightly quicker now, more purposeful. The digital clock on the screen reads 8:45. Outside, just a few blocks to the north, the low-frequency roar of jet engines is beginning to vibrate through the canyon of streets, a sound that many New Yorkers initially mistook for the thunder of a passing train or a low-flying helicopter. Did she hear it? Did she feel the air pressure change as the massive aircraft banked toward the North Tower? The video offers no sound, only the silent, jerky motion of the silhouette heading back into the glare. At 8:46, as the first plane impacts the tower, the woman vanishes from the camera's view. She steps out through the glass doors, disappearing into the brilliance of the morning. It is a departure of profound ambiguity. If it was Sneha, she was standing mere minutes away from a catastrophe that would call upon every ounce of her medical training. The theory held by her family is that she saw the smoke, she heard the screams, and she ran toward the chaos instead of away from it. She was a healer, after all, and the impulse to help would have been as natural to her as breathing. But the detectives who studied the grain of that film saw different possibilities hidden in the static. They noted the lack of bags. They questioned why she would return so late, only to leave again before even reaching her door. The quality of the tape, they argued, was too poor for a definitive identification. To them, it was a Rorschach test of a disappearance. To a grieving husband, it was the last visual evidence of a life he was desperate to hold onto. To a cynical investigator, it was a shadow that could have belonged to anyone. The footage was reviewed hundreds of times, the tape growing worn as it was paused and rewound, seeking a detail that wasn't there. They looked for a glint of jewelry, a specific pattern on the dress, a flicker of a smile that might confirm her identity. But the sun of that September morning remained too bright, the technology of 2001 too limited. The woman in the lobby remained a cipher, a person caught in the precise moment between being found and being lost forever. She walked out of the frame and into the historical record, leaving behind nothing but a few megabytes of grainy, black and white data. The investigation would eventually move beyond the lobby of 225 Rector Place, but the image of that woman would linger like a ghost in the minds of everyone involved. It represented the tantalizing proximity of the truth. She was right there, just feet away from safety, just minutes away from her husband and her home. The silence of the apartment she never reached was deafening. Inside, the two cats, Figa and Collie, would have been waiting for the sound of a key in the lock, a sound that never came. The bed remained made, the air still, while just outside the windows, the world was being torn apart. The footage at 8:43 is a haunting reminder that in the city of millions, a person can be seen, recorded, and documented, and yet still remain entirely unknown. As the sun rose higher on that Tuesday morning, the figure in the lobby became part of the larger tragedy, her individual mystery swallowed by a collective grief. But for Ron, that grainy silhouette was everything. It was the last time he could look at a screen and believe, if only for a few flickering seconds, that his wife was coming home. The investigation soon drifted away from the flickering shadows of the lobby at 225 Rector Place and into the sterile, high-ceilinged chambers of the New York legal system. The transition was jarring. The air in the Manhattan Surrogates Court felt thin, carrying the faint, sharp scent of floor wax and the dry, heavy odor of aged parchment. It was a space designed for absolute order, where the messy, jagged edges of a human life were expected to be smoothed into neat categories, dates, and cold legal definitions. For Sneha's family, the courtroom was not a place of healing, but a second battlefield. They sat on the heavy oak benches, the wood grain smooth and unyielding beneath their palms, listening as the city began to dismantle the memory of the woman they loved. Outside the tall, narrow windows, the city continued its relentless hum, the distant rumble of the subway vibrating faintly through the floorboards, a rhythmic pulsing that felt like a heartbeat the court was trying to stop. Every rustle of a manila folder and every scratch of a pen against a legal pad seemed magnified in the oppressive silence of the chamber. This was no longer just about a missing person. It was about the burden of proof, a heavy, invisible weight that the family was forced to carry through the long, shadowed corridors of the bureaucracy. The New York City Police Department presented a narrative that felt like a dark reflection of the Sneha they knew. Their reports were thick, filled with typed observations that felt clinical and detached. They spoke of a woman facing a mountain of personal struggles, focusing intently on the months leading up to that September morning. The detectives detailed her departure from Cabrini Medical Center and her subsequent suspension from St. Vincent's Medical Center on Staten Island. They noted her missed appointments with substance abuse counselors and a pending misdemeanor charge for degree falsely reporting an incident. To the investigators, these were not just life hurdles. They were evidence of a desire to vanish. They whispered of late nights spent in the dimly lit corners of bars, suggesting a secret life that her family could not possibly understand. The court heard allegations of marital friction and explosive arguments, painting a portrait of a woman standing at the edge of a precipice, looking for a way out. Every piece of testimony felt like a cold stone being added to a wall between Sneha and the towers. The city argued that it was just as likely she had been the victim of a random act of violence on the night of September 10th. Or perhaps she had simply stepped away from the crushing weight of her own life, leaving the kittens, the orchids, and her husband behind in the gray dust of lower Manhattan. Ron and the Philip family watched as the legal system quantified their grief. They presented their own evidence, the small, tangible remnants of a life interrupted. They spoke of the 4 purple and white orchids Sneha had repotted that very afternoon, the way she had placed them in the bathtub to dry, a sign of someone planning for a tomorrow that never came. They pointed to her passport, her driver's license, and her credit cards, all left behind in the apartment. To them, the idea of Sneha running away was a hollow theory, a ghost story told by those who didn't want to admit the truth. They spoke of her heart, her medical training, and the fierce, protective instinct that defined her. If she was near those towers when the first plane struck at 8:46 in the morning, they knew with a bone-deep certainty that she would not have run away. She would have run toward the fire. They pictured her in the chaos, her sandals clicking against the soot-covered pavement, her black hair pulled back, her eyes searching for anyone who needed help. But the court demanded more than intuition. It demanded a physical presence at the site, a piece of clothing, a DNA match, or a witness who could place her firmly within the footprint of ground zero. Without it, she was a woman caught in a legal limbo, a name floating in the ether between the missing and the dead. In June of 2006, the first hammer fell. Judge Renee Roth issued a ruling that felt like a closing door. She stated that there was insufficient evidence to prove Sneha had died in the attacks of September 11th. Instead, the court applied the standard state law for missing persons, setting her official date of death as September 10th, 2004, exactly 3 years after her disappearance was first reported. It was a clinical, procedural decision that carried the weight of a sentence. By shifting the date, the court effectively separated Sneha from the history of that day. She was no longer a victim of the towers. She was a footnote, a woman who had simply ceased to exist on a random Monday night. The family felt the sting of this exclusion like a physical blow. To them, it felt as though the city was trying to erase her heroism, replacing it with the sordid details of a police report. They looked at the list of victims, thousands of names etched in bronze and stone, and saw a space where Sneha belonged. They refused to accept a death date that suggested she had spent 3 years hiding in the shadows of the world she had once served so vibrantly. The fight moved to the appellate division, where the air was even colder and the stakes even higher. The family's attorneys argued that the previous ruling relied on what they called the rankest speculation. They pointed to the case of Juan Lafuente, another victim whose presence at the towers had been proven through similar circumstantial logic. Why was Sneha being held to a different standard? They leaned into the logic of her profession. A doctor is a doctor even when she is off duty, they argued. The proximity of her apartment to the World Trade Center made it highly probable that she would have been caught in the initial surge of rescuers. They asked the judges to consider the silence that followed. In the years since 2001, not a single trace of her had surfaced anywhere in the world. No bank accounts opened, no sightings in distant cities, no whispers of a new life. The silence was its own kind of proof. It was the silence of someone who had been swallowed by the immense, tragic force of the collapse. They asked the court to look past the character attacks and see the woman who had spent her life healing others, even when her own path was difficult. Finally, in January of 2008, the silence was broken by a new ruling. In a 3-2 decision, the New York State Supreme Court's Appellate Division reversed the lower court's finding. Justice David Sachs wrote the majority opinion, his words cutting through years of legal fog. He stated that the evidence showed it was highly probable she had died that morning at the World Trade Center. He dismissed the theories of her voluntary disappearance as mere conjecture, noting that only the most cynical interpretation of her life led to any other conclusion. With the stroke of a pen, Sneha Philip was officially declared the 2,751st victim of the terrorist attacks. Her date of death was moved back to September 11, 2001. It was a victory, but a somber one. There were no cheers in the courtroom, only a quiet, heavy sense of recognition. Her name would finally be added to the memorial, joined with the others in the long, silver lines of history. The burden of proof had been lifted, but the mystery of her final moments remained tucked away in the shadows of the morning sun, a story that only the dust and the stone of Lower Manhattan truly knew. The air in late January of 2008 was a biting, crystalline cold that seemed to settle into the very stones of the New York State Supreme Court building. Inside those hallowed halls, where the scent of old paper and floor wax lingers in the corners of every chamber, a long and agonizing silence was finally about to be broken. For years, the story of Sneha Philip had been suspended in a legal and emotional purgatory. She was a ghost of the city, a name caught between the tragic heroism of a national catastrophe and the shadowed whispers of a private, troubled life. But on January 31st, 2008, a panel of 5 judges gathered to deliver a decision that would forever weave her name into the tapestry of the city's most painful mourning. The courtroom felt vast, the high ceilings swallowing the nervous breaths of those who had waited nearly 7 years for this moment. A 3-2 decision was reached, a narrow but definitive shift in the scales of justice. The Appellate Division of the New York State Supreme Court looked upon the evidence, or the lack thereof, and chose to see not a woman fleeing a complicated reality, but a physician who ran toward the fire. In that instant, with the strike of a gavel that echoed like a soft heartbeat against the wood, the previous ruling was overturned. Sneha was no longer a person who had simply vanished on the 10th of September. She was officially declared a victim of the attacks on the 11th. Justice David Sachs, writing for the majority, used words that would become a sanctuary for Sneha's family. He spoke of the inherent nature of a doctor, the instinctive pull toward those in need that defines the very core of a medical professional. He noted that while there was no video of her entering the North Tower, no DNA found in the shifting dust of Ground Zero, the circumstantial evidence pointed toward a singular, noble conclusion. He famously wrote that to believe anything else was to engage in the rankest speculation. Imagine the scene the court must have envisioned. A woman in a brown, collared dress, perhaps still carrying the shopping bags from Century 21, standing on the sidewalk as the world above her shattered. She would have heard the roar, felt the ground tremble beneath her feet, and seen the first plumes of smoke blooming against the bright blue September sky. In that moment of absolute chaos, the court believed her training took hold. The fear that would have paralyzed many was replaced by the urgent, rhythmic pulse of a healer's duty. She would have moved toward the epicenter, her figure disappearing into the roiling gray clouds, a shadow lost in the light of her own bravery. With this ruling, Sneha Philip was designated as the 2,751st victim of the collapse of the Twin Towers. If you were to walk today through the memorial in Lower Manhattan, you would feel the heavy, humid air rising from the falling water. The sound is a constant, low-frequency roar, a white noise that masks the bustling city sounds of honking taxis and shuffling tourists. It is a place of profound, heavy peace. On the South Pool, if you run your fingers along the cool, dark bronze of the parapet, you will eventually find her. There, on panel S66, her name is etched with a clean, permanent precision. SNEHAANNEPHILIP. The letters feel smooth under the thumb, chilled by the breeze or warmed by the rare afternoon sun. This is her only headstone. Her family has placed flowers in the grooves of those letters on her birthday, the bright petals of roses or carnations standing out against the somber metal. Her mother, Ansu, often visits on that day, choosing the quiet celebration of her daughter's birth over the deafening grief of the 11th. In their home in Poughkeepsie, Sneha's childhood bedroom remains a frozen capsule of time. Her diplomas hang on the wall, the gold seals catching the dim light. Her books sit on the shelves, their spines fading slowly as the years turn. It is a room of echoes, a space where she is still the bright, artistic girl who loved to paint and dreamed of saving lives, untouched by the complexities that would later define her final days. Yet, even with the finality of the court's decree and the bronze permanence of the memorial, the mind lingers on the things that were never found. Where are the 3 pairs of shoes she bought that evening? Where is the lingerie and the Italian bed linens that cost $550? Those bags, heavy with the mundane plans of a woman preparing for a dinner party, have never surfaced. There is the mystery of the woman she was seen with on the surveillance footage at 7:18 in the evening, the companion who never came forward, whose identity remains a locked door in this narrative. And then there is the silence of her apartment. Ron returned home at midnight to a quiet, empty space. He woke up at 6:30 the next morning, and the bed was still unmade, the other side cold. If she had come home, there would have been a sign, a discarded shoe, the rustle of a shopping bag, the scent of her perfume in the air. But there was only the stillness of a morning that was about to change the world forever. These questions do not change the verdict, but they hang in the air like the fine mist from the memorial pools, translucent and impossible to grasp. They are the fragments of a life that was lived in the vibrant, messy, and beautiful colors of reality, far beyond the reach of legal documents or police reports. We are left with the image of a woman who is both a mystery and a hero. Sneha Philip represents the thousands of stories that were interrupted that day, but hers carries a unique weight, the weight of the unknown. She reminds us that every person we pass on the street carries a hidden world within them, a blend of struggles and aspirations that most will never see. Her legacy is not found in the scandals or the court battles, but in the quiet recognition that in the face of absolute darkness, we hope for the light of the human spirit to prevail. Her husband, Ron, eventually moved on, remarrying with the blessing of her family, but he never truly let go of the woman he shared a life with in Battery Park City. He fought for her name because he knew her heart. As the sun sets over the Hudson River, casting long, golden shadows across the pavement where she once walked, we allow the questions to soften. The truth of her final moments may be buried beneath layers of time and debris, but her presence remains. She is a part of the city now, a part of the wind that whistles through the skyscrapers and the water that falls eternally into the deep, dark pools. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.